Hello, friends, and welcome. I'm your co-host, Andrew Lazaga, here with Dubside.
And you're listening to the Dubcast with Dubside.
So, Dubside, how are things?
Pretty good.
You get a chance to listen to Pamela Power's interview?
Actually, I did. I did hear that. Yeah, that was very interesting. I do think that Freya pygmy kayak does roll extremely well. I found that out myself.
Yeah, I wish I had a chance to try it.
So he closed down the company and didn't sell it overseas. That was quite interesting.
It would have been nice to at least have the plans available for those kayaks. You know, you can send them to someone who could cut them out using a CNC machine and get your panels and you can build the kayak yourself.
Hmm.
For instance, Warren Williamson has built a number of stitch and glue kayaks that he designed himself. And he made the plans on Rhino with computer-aided design software and sent them into Chesapeake Lightcraft and had his panels cut out.
Right.
Yeah. I liked her description of getting into that flow state of focusing your attention and emptying your mind of all the problems.
Yeah. It reminded me of this analogy I thought of when you're not in the moment. You know, you're thinking about what you have to do tomorrow and you have all this other stuff to do it, and that weighs on your mind. But more of what I find people in Greenland, they're living more in the moment. When you really have to be in the moment is when you're hunting and you've got the wounded seal on the other end of your harpoon or something like that. You cannot be thinking about what you got to do tomorrow and what you had for dinner.
Yeah.
You are right there, right at all your energy is focused right at that moment. And so when she talked about just being, putting all the other stuff aside and being right there at that time, that's the same idea.
Yep. And when that happens, time just flies.
Yeah.
You know where I get that feeling was actually in building kayaks.
Mm-hmm.
And I would work a full day, come home, and then spend the rest of the evening in the shop building a kayak. And before you know it, it's midnight. And it's like, wow, where did the time go?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were going to go to SK 102.
Yes. We had SK 102. Was that 2 or 3 weeks ago? And it went very well. It was a little bit smaller even than the one after COVID. The site had some reduced parking this time because somebody bought some property next door that they used to use for parking. But so it was down to, we had less than 20 students. The ones that came got really lucky to have almost one-on-one instruction. Some of them really made the most of that and had a very, very nice time. We're very happy about that.
Back up a minute, then explain what SK102 is again. I know we did a whole episode on it.
SK102, yes, good question. SK102 is an event outside of Washington, D.C. that's run by the Chesapeake Paddlers Association, which is probably the biggest paddling group in the Washington, D.C. area. And SK102 is an introductory event. It's sort of the second introductory event. They have a one-day thing, SK101. You can just come and find out about what kayaking is all about, and if you're interested. And SK102 is a weekend where they have instruction and training in various disciplines of, speed paddling, wing paddles, and regular paddling with the Euro paddle and the Greenland stuff. They've been running that for I think 20 years or so. And so on the podcast here, we had the interview with David and Teresa, who own the property. And we also had, it was a special guest with Brian Blankenship, who was the one who originated that event way back when. If any people have heard those events, that's SK102. That's what that is.
That's the event on the lake by the power plant
Yes. Yep.
The nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
So what were the highlights?
The most significant thing for me was that after the event, that we did all the cleanup. I was there till Sunday, like 6:00, until there was like 3 or 4 people left, because there's so much work to do to make that happen, both before and after. But the organizer, Kat Triana is her name, who took it over from Brian Blankenship, who still comes to this thing. She managed to get, after some back and forth and waiting, to get Maligiak on the phone, and I was able to talk to Maligiak, and I haven't talked to him in like 5 years.
Wow.
we had a lot of catching up to do. So yeah, it was great. So he's living in Nuuk now, and he's got this girlfriend. Him and his girlfriend, they've been doing some foster parenting.
Oh,
which he finds really interesting. And like I think it sounds like he's training these kids. I don't know what ages they are, like as in super athletes. He's got them out doing workouts in the morning and that kind of thing. And he said they really enjoying that. And his various contacts in like Canada and Alaska to do build kayaks for communities that are trying to reintroduce their thing. That COVID kind of put that on halt for a while, so it's kind of slowed down. But he'll be working back up into that at some point. And so then I was telling him how the competitions in Kokotok in South Greenland. He's not going to be going down to that. He says he's been training some people to help them, when they compete, but he hasn't gotten involved directly for other various reasons. So, but then I told him I'm going up to Nuuk afterwards. I got some interviews I want to do up there, which he didn't know about that. But he said he was doing some guiding somebody or taking somebody somewhere for something he had on his schedule. And I told him that I'd be the days that I would be there, and he said, "Oh, it didn't quite look like it would hook up." But then he, right on the spot, he's like, "Oh, let me just rearrange this." So he's making the arrangement so we can hang out together for a couple of days. So yeah, I was very happy about that. So I'll see him, and then I said, "Yeah, how about if I interview you for my podcast?" He goes, "Oh yeah, we can do that. Yeah, I'll make dinner. I'll get some food."
Awesome.
I said, "Yep, we're doing it." So yeah, that should be something to look forward to. Yeah, I was trying to explain to him the index thing that I did, our spreadsheet index thing. So that's on. You have to go to your Dashpoint Pirate site to find that. And
that's right.
Yeah. But anyway, if you dig far enough, anyway. And I was explaining to him, I don't know if he quite understood what I was talking about, but I said, there's that list every subject, every topic I ever go through, in every episode, for just so he can find it. And I said, do you know what by far the most numerous subject, the thing that's like twice as much as anything else? And he says, "What?" And, he didn't quite know what I was talking. I said, "Maligiac, you." So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's about time we had him on this podcast.
Indeed.
Awesome. So shall we proceed to the main event?
Yes, number 55, right?
Yes, number 55.
Welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. This is Dubcast number 55. Maritime disasters and ways to avoid them. The music featured at the end of this episode is a song called Galashlit Nunat Bishlugu, originally recorded by Yuli Berthelsen. We'll start with a little history. So by the 1920s, 1930s, Greenland is still a colony of Denmark. And in putting into place the idea that the Inuits should control their own land, a guy comes of age named Ågo Lund. And he gets involved in politics. And, you get any set of people, there'll be some natural leaders in the midst. And he proves himself to be quite a capable leader. And he takes on a lot of community involvement. And he's also a writer. And over time he does novels, textbooks, and many articles. And by about 1939... the Danish Parliament has a Greenland committee, and he serves on that committee. And by 1950 or so, he is widely seen as the leading politician in Greenland. And in 1953, when the people in Greenland are given full Danish citizenship, as Kenneth Høeg described when I interviewed him a few episodes back. So Ågo Lund becomes the Greenland representative to the Danish Parliament in 1953. Widely seen as a very strong advocate for the Inuit people. By all accounts, a very capable man for the job. And one example of this is in 1952, he became a Knight of the Order of Dannebrog. This is an award that Denmark gives to people for their significant contributions or distinguished service. It was started in 1671 by the King of Denmark at the time. Now, here's another little piece of history. In 1959, they completed the building of a new ship to make the voyages from Denmark to Greenland. And this ship was named the Hans Hedtoft. Hans Hedtoft was a former prime minister of Denmark. And this ship was made with a double hull and reinforced bow to break through ice, and 7 watertight compartments, so very, very safe for that area of travel in the Arctic Ocean. Now, it wasn't a tremendously huge ship, but it had capacity of about 60 passengers with a crew of 40, as well as room for cargo. So in the end of January 1959, it made its first voyage to Greenland from Copenhagen, and it stopped in Qaqortoq and Nuuk and Sisimiut. And for the trip back to Copenhagen, Algo Lunge, who I just told you about, was on board. And as the ship went around Cape Farewell, the southern tip of Greenland, it struck an iceberg. Well, they started taking on a lot of water. The captain put out a distress signal. But the weather was turning very bad, and none of the ships that heard the distress call could get there in time. The ship sank, and there were no survivors found. And that included Algo Lunge. Well, striking an iceberg with what's considered to be a very safe ship and going down certainly brings to mind the Titanic. So to compare these two events, the Titanic was 1912, and this is January 30th, 1959 we're talking about here. The Titanic was 882 feet long, much larger ship. The Hans Hedtoft was 271 feet long. The Titanic had a capacity of somewhat more than 3,000 people, of which 1,500 people died. The Hans Hedtoft had a capacity of 100 people and was only carrying 95 people, and they all died. So the scale of the disaster is somewhat different from the Titanic, but for the people of Greenland, just as traumatic, or in some ways even more so. If you calculate the casualties as a percentage of the population of each country, the Titanic, it was 0.0008%. For Greenland, it comes out to 0.3%. So on a per capita basis, the Hans Hedtoft disaster of 1959 was 100 times worse than the Titanic in 1912. And besides the people lost, on that ship happened to be the parish registers. So these are the documents from all the town churches where would be recorded marriages, births, and deaths going back for many, many years. So these records were being taken to Denmark to archive them properly and store them. Well, they all went down with the ship. So that makes genealogical research and historical investigation that much more difficult if you're looking at records in Greenland from the 40s and 50s. And incidentally, this is the last recorded sinking of a ship by an iceberg with casualties. Since then, any time that has happened, there have been rescue efforts have gotten underway fast enough to prevent the loss of life. Back in Dubcast number 43, I described the scoreboards I made for the competition and the team of people I had built up with that effort. An unforeseen disaster struck, and I was knocked right back to zero with that project. So my own personal setback there would be parallel to Greenland's setback with loss of a top politician and a significant part of the population, as well as the historical records. But knowing what I know about Inuit culture, I have no doubt that back then the people said, well, this is a really bad situation, but we'll just get through it. We'll figure out a way to make things work and carry on. And that is what they did. Well, I'm going to switch now to more recent times. In 2013, I was in Pamiut. That year, the kayak competition was in Ilulissat, but afterwards I went down to Pamiut, farther south in Greenland. And I came across in the harbor some folks that had about a 40-some foot sailing yacht. They're a very friendly couple. And they had a younger guy with them who was from Scotland. And they had sailed to Greenland from, I think, North Carolina. And the younger guy was getting a ride back to Scotland, I guess. And so I hung out with them a little bit, went on board and saw their ship and all that. They've got all the stuff you need in there to do these big voyages. Not a whole lot of room underneath there because you have lots of gear, but they had it all figured out. And they had this drone that they were doing videos with. And this is 2013, so I think drone technology has come quite a ways since then. And the guy was describing how it had to be careful with it. If it didn't have, this is before they had the homing program where it'll just come back to where it started from if something loses the connection. But this thing, it would suddenly just stop working properly and crash. And so they took it out, and it did crash. One time you had to go find it and hope it didn't hit anything. But they were playing around with it. They had the glasses that the person flying it puts on, and they can see what the camera sees. I was heading down about 30 or 40 miles down the coast, going to be taken there. Some people were meeting there for some other event thing. And so the guy with this yacht, he was looking at his weather information. And he would have wanted to go down. There was this festivity going on and go check that out and just sail his yacht down there. But he decided not to because he could see the weather was a little bit more than he wanted to deal with. And so they just stayed in the harbor there. They didn't go down outside on the exposed area. Now, when he had first told me that they had come from North Carolina to Greenland, I was quite impressed. But watching how he operated, I got a sense for how you make a big excursion like that far less daunting. All you have to do is not travel on a deadline. You can come up the coast of the U.S., staying on the intercoastal waterway in the protected areas, and every so often you come to place where you have to go out to an exposed area. And then you just sit there in the protected port and look at your weather forecasts and wait until you get a window of weather that you're comfortable with. And this is in stark contrast to commercial operations of ships and tugs where you've got to be on a schedule. And in those situations, those captains, when the weather gets bad, that's when they really earn their money. Because if things are calm, you can say the first or second mate, tell them, you got it, I'm going to go take a nap, go sleep for the night. But when the weather's really bad and you don't have the luxury of just waiting it out, that's when the years of experience of a good captain come into play. Contrast this with how we paddle as recreational kayakers. You got a lot more leeway to decide just not to go out if you don't like the conditions. And there's the difference between what Paninguak Corneliusen in episode 51 talked about her grandfather, how he used a kayak, and how she saw us using kayaks. If you're going out to hunt food to feed your family, it adds to the pressure to push the envelope. It's easy to say in hindsight, looking at a disaster, that somebody should have known better and should have backed off and not pushed their limits, like the captain of the Titanic shouldn't have tried to go so fast. But there's really no easy answer. You have to carefully assess the situation and take into account your skills and your experience and make a decision using your best judgment. I can think of one shining example of this kind of good judgment coming into play, and this is Alex Honnold, the guy who climbed El Capitan unaided. And the movie Free Solo describes that. And if you see that movie, he's got a whole team of people, of the photographers and people are going to film him doing this thing, even though he's not going to be attached to ropes himself. And they decide the day comes, and he says, all right, this is it. And they get out there, and he starts climbing. And he knew this is an extremely exacting task. I mean, everything had to be just right. It was, very dangerous, and the conditions had to be perfect. So he starts climbing, and it's, like 20 minutes into it, and he calls it off. Based on his intuition and his judgment, he was feeling that it wasn't a good day. And he came back down, and he told the guys, just not today, not going to do it. At some point later, he does go back and makes the climb and succeeds, and it becomes something of a sensation. But what impresses me the most about that is that he had the good judgment to turn around, even after he'd already started climbing on the first try. Well, now let's go back to the 1920s and consider a guy named Captain Franz Romer. And so in the 20s, you have Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic in a plane, first one to do so. And Franz Romer was also a pilot, and I guess he was after that title as well, but Charles Lindbergh beat him to it. So the German manufacturer Klepper, who I believe are still making kayaks today, folding kayaks, offered to give him a challenge. They wanted him to paddle. They wanted him to take a Klepper kayak across the Atlantic instead of a plane. And so Captain Romer took them up on the offer, had them make him a special custom kayak. It was 21 feet long with a sail on it. So he didn't actually paddle across the Atlantic. He sailed across the Atlantic in a kayak. But he embarked on this trip in 1928, and he went down to from Portugal, I think, down to the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, and then from there set off following the trade winds to blow him across. And he was so packed in with food on the start of the trip that he could only stretch his legs if he stood up, which made him very unstable. So things were quite cramped. And the salt water on your skin, if you have no opportunity to dry it off for days and days, you get these big sores and blisters. It does a number on your body. And so he actually got to the St. Thomas on the Virgin Islands after 58 days. And he had sharks following him. He had quite a time. He was navigating with just a sextant and a compass and binoculars. But he made it to the Virgin Islands in rather bad shape. It took him some time to recover. But they eventually publicity got to him, and they recognized him. He had praise and things. So then he continues on to come to Puerto Rico. And as the summer continues, he's destined for New York City. There was somebody that offered some prize money for this trip if he made it to New York. So he leaves Puerto Rico in his kayak. And this is 1928. This is well before the modern weather forecasting techniques. As a matter of fact, this is before the era of weather satellites. I'm aware of the first weather satellite successfully launched. That was 1960. It came back with some photos, and they looked at the photos, and no one had ever before seen what a hurricane looks like from outer space. Nowadays, we're quite familiar with the big circular cloud formation that depicts a hurricane from an aerial view, but back then, nobody had seen that. So before weather satellites, they knew what hurricanes on ground are like, strong winds, and they change directions. But the predictive abilities were not nearly as sophisticated as they are today. Whereas we can see them forming off the coast of Africa and predict that within a week they'll be hitting the American continent at some point. And the warning goes out, and then it's just a matter of predicting the actual path that it will follow. And nowadays, I see everybody on their phone pulling out. They're looking at the rain patterns in the area with the aerial view, and a continuation of the things that the guy in Pamiute on his yacht was looking at to predict how bad the weather was going to be where he had to go. Well, Captain Romer did not have the benefit of such things. So he embarks out of Puerto Rico. And about an hour after he left, they got the word that a major hurricane was coming their way. And this became a Category 5 storm with winds of 160 miles an hour. Well, this hurricane came through a path along some islands in the Caribbean and ending in Florida. And the devastation amounted to 4,000 deaths and lots of property damage. Well, Captain Romer went right into the middle of this storm and was never seen again. I believe the record indicates that he was aware of the hurricane season quickly approaching, and maybe if he had had no deadline or no schedule to keep, he could have hung out in the Caribbean for as long as he wanted to, and then take a nice casual trip to the U.S. mainland when the conditions were extremely calm. But he didn't do that. If when he left he had some inclination or a little intuitive nudge telling him that it wasn't going to work that time, I suppose he could have turned around and come back. But we will never know what he was thinking. A story with a better outcome occurs in 1957, 30 years and a world war later, when Dr. Hans Lindemann, a German, crosses the Atlantic in 72 days using a Klepper double folding kayak that he had put 2 masts and an outrigger on. Otherwise, it was a fairly stock Klepper. And in trying to steer the kayak and keep from capsizing, he got very little sleep. Endured a lot of rough conditions and storms, but he had trained for this trip, and a lot of his training involved mental conditioning, so that even if he was delirious, he would know to keep on traveling west and not give up. Well, the kayak did capsize a number of times, and he did lose some gear and supplies at some of these incidents, but he made it all the way to the Caribbean island of St. Martin. And he later wrote a book called Alone at Sea. And to tie up a few loose ends here, the Titanic has been located, as well documented, and the people have gone down and explored it, etc. But the Hans Hedolf has never been located. And I would imagine it is still down there on the bottom of the ocean somewhere. And all those records are not destroyed. They're there. So it could theoretically be recovered, although that would be very costly. But it's possible to do that. While researching my records, I went back to 2013, my trip to Greenland, and found out that I had written down the names of the people in that yacht that had sailed up from North Carolina on the way to Scotland. There was a guy named Drake and a woman named Monique, and there was something about Paragon. Well, it turns out, under the name DrakeParagon, they are still traveling in their yacht and putting up videos on a regular basis. They have a YouTube channel or something like that. And I think at the moment they are on the coast of Scotland. And he's got a video where you can see him consulting his weather data in determining when the best time to head on to the next location. In a sailing yacht, you need some wind to actually get the thing to move. So you don't want perfect calm, but you don't want too much wind or wind in the wrong direction. So that is DrakeParagon. And shout out to Monique and Drake. I first got into Greenlandic music 20 years ago. And during that time, the top female vocalists I got familiar with, and I've given you some of their music in prior Dubcasts. People such as Stine Jakobsen, Katsi Kleist, Tuparnak, and Nina. And I haven't mentioned another one in that same league. And she did a lot of her stuff in English, but she did do some pieces in Greenlandic. And I'm talking about, we would call her Julie, but they would say in Greenland, Julie Berthelsen. She was one of the top Greenlandic vocalists for a long, long time. And she did put out a song that's called Galashlit Nunat Bishlugu. And I'm going to show you my version of that right now. Asamir asatutsegut angutit ashlakat nunamut ashlamut ularingilagut asaru samata takuti tishlu asamata takuti tishlu asasisasauti tamavisinu anashtusi Nukisita mavisa tosila angusa samut pizza sumu Asami asatutsi anguti ashtakat nunamut ashlamut Ularingilagut asaru samata takuti tishtu asamata Takutitis luasus isasauti Damabisinu anashtusi Lukisita mavisa tosihilat Angusa samut pizza sumu Periatsutia putra matauna Tuniyune atisanagu Lukiyuta mavisa tusashlu Galashlit nunat bishlugu Takutitis luasus isasauti Damabisinu anashtusi Lukisita mavisa tosila Angusa samut pizza sumu Periatsutia puta matauna Tuniyune atusanagu Lukiyuta mavisa tusashlu Galashlit nunat bishlugu That song is the fight song for the Greenland handball team. Now, in this country, if I say handball, you probably think I'm talking about the predecessor to racquetball. You played in a court with walls and 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, but that is not what handball refers to in Europe and other parts of the world. Look it up yourself. Handball in Europe refers to a game played teams of 7 on 7, in a court that's a little bit smaller than a basketball court. And it has things that look like smaller soccer goals. And you're trying to throw the ball into the goal. There's a goalkeeper and there are various other rules. So the ball is a little bit smaller than a basketball, so you can hold it with one hand easier. In Europe, where this originated more than 100 years ago, it is now a big deal. It's probably as big as basketball is in America. You have national teams, various leagues, television coverage. It's a big sport. Big enough that people can make a living as a professional handball player. The special guest I interviewed a while back, Kenneth Høeg, the Greenland plenipotentiary. That is a word in the English language. Plenipotentiary. Look it up. Means a diplomat with full authority. Well, one of Kenneth's 4 grown children is a professional handball player in Sweden. And he is married to Julie Berthelsen, who did that song. Later in her career, Julie had a lot of success with a group called the Julie All-Stars, which included Nina. And Julie's earlier CDs are still available at atlanticmusic.gl. That includes a compilation CD called Zedna, Zedna, which has several other artists on it. I recommend it. Coming up in episode 56 is a story I have been wanting to tell for a long time. You won't want to miss it.